The Great Siege of Gibraltar was part of the American Revolutionary War. It was the biggest battle of that war, fought by Britain against America's allies, France and Spain. It was the longest siege in British military history. The story of the Great Siege of Gibraltar, which was to last for 3 years, 7 months and 12 days, far longer than, for example, the sieges of Leningrad and Malta during the Second World War, starts 100 years earlier when England was emerging as a maritime power and started to seek a naval base in the Mediterranean. The Portuguese-held port of Tangier was acquired as part of Catherine Berganza's dowry on her marriage to King Charles II. Vast sums of money were spent trying to convert it into a naval base, but it proved unsuitable and too costly. By the year 1700, the English had abandoned this port, having first completely destroyed it. That same year, the Habsburg King Carlos II of Spain died. Louis XIV, the Bourbon King of France, quickly seized the vacant throne and installed his grandson as King Philip V. As Britain viewed France as the greatest threat to its ambition, they backed the rival Habsburg claim to the Spanish throne. So started the War of Spanish Succession, in which the Duke of Marlborough led a Grand Alliance army to a series of stunning victories over the French. Meanwhile, Admiral Sir George Rooke, the commander of the British fleet in the Mediterranean, was ordered to acquire a naval base in that region. He considered both Cadiz and Barcelona, but both were far too well defended to take by force. But by chance, in 1704, he sailed into the Bay of Gibraltar to find the rocky peninsula lightly defended and therefore quickly captured. Britain successfully held Gibraltar throughout that war, and so was granted perpetual ownership of Gibraltar plus Minorca in the Treaty of Utrecht. In return, Britain recognized the Bourbon Philip V as King of Spain. With France and Spain both under the control of the Bourbon family, they agreed a family compact alliance and sought to recapture Gibraltar. However, during the 7 Years' War, Britain defeated the French at Quebec, capturing France's colonies in North America. At the same time, Britain also captured both Manila and Havana from the Spanish. In the war-ending Treaty of Paris, Britain kept all France's lost colonies in North America, while Spain handed over Florida in exchange for the return of her territories. France and Spain were unhappy with the outcome and sought opportunities to regain their lost possessions. Such an opportunity arose in 1775 when rebellion broke out in 13 British colonies in North America. The French and the Spanish immediately supplied the rebels with funding, guns, and ammunition before joining them as allies against Britain. Spain's motivation was the capture of Gibraltar. They agreed with France that neither country would make peace or agree to any truce with the British until the rock had been recovered. Additionally, they agreed Gibraltar would not be used in any exchange to recover lost territories in North America. And finally, they agreed that Gibraltar's recovery would be followed by an invasion of Britain to force a recovery of their American territories. Given Britain's preoccupation with war in North America, the Spanish believed that the capture of Gibraltar would be simple. So in June 1779, they started to besiege the small British possession, while, at the same time, the French attacked the British in Minorca. For this siege, they deployed 16 infantry battalions, 12 squadrons of cavalry, plus innumerable pieces of artillery. In all, 14,000 soldiers. The naval blockade consisted of 11 ships of the line, plus 2 frigates. In comparison, the British had less than 6,000 men, 6 British infantry battalions, and 3 Hanoverian regiments, plus a detachment from the Royal Artillery and a number of military engineers in a locally raised unit called the Soldier Artificer Company. There was also a small naval attachment, including a former ship of the line that was permanently moored in the harbour as a floating battery, plus the frigate HMS Enterprise and 12 gunboats. The Spanish were commanded by their General Martin de Sotomayor and the British by General George Elliot, the Governor of Gibraltar. Elliot immediately set about strengthening the defences, especially the town walls, increasing the number of guns deployed to 412. Numerous infantry soldiers had to be trained to assist the gunners, while others were formed into a unit of deadly sharpshooters. These improvements were quickly implemented, as additional supplies had already been provisioned in anticipation of an attack on Gibraltar. Siege preparations thus inspired confidence amongst the garrison. The Spanish established their siege lines on the isthmus that joins Gibraltar to the mainland. Here they constructed forts, redoubts, trenches and gun batteries from which to launch attacks. Despite the British managing to capture further supplies arriving for the Spanish by sea, by the winter provisions for the garrison had become scarce. Bread was almost completely non-existent, so salt meat, biscuit and a little rice became the basis of everyone's diet. Fuel was totally exhausted, so fires for cooking were limited and only possible by the burning of salt-encrusted timbers of old ships broken up in the harbour. As a result, there was an outbreak of scurvy. Elliot appealed to London for resupply, and in December a heavily escorted convoy sailed from Britain under the command of Admiral George Rodney. In early January, it encountered a Spanish convoy off the northwest coast of Spain, which was swiftly captured. In response, the Spanish sent a fleet under Juan de la Gara to attack the British fleet, but they were soundly defeated at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, where the British managed to capture a further 5 Spanish ships of the line. By the end of January 1780, Rodney's fleet has resupplied Gibraltar, including supplies from captured Spanish cargo ships. They also delivered 1,000 troops from the Highland Regiment. But within 9 months, provisions were once again running low, and scurvy re-emerged, reducing the effectiveness of the garrison. As winter approached, the garrison faced the enemy, the elements, disease and starvation in equal measure, and by the spring of 1781, the garrison and civilian population were on bare rations. By April, the Spanish felt the blockade was working, only to see a massive convoy of 100 supply ships escorted by 29 British ships of the line under Admiral George Derby break through the naval blockade. Frustrated, the Spanish attempted to bombard the supply ships. They caused extensive damage to the town, but the South Mole where the supply ships were being unloaded remained out of range. Admiral Derby sailed for home once again, breaking through the Spanish blockade with ease and taking with him 1,000 civilians, thus leaving the garrison with fewer mouths to feed. Left behind was a plentiful supply of black powder, guns, ammunition, as well as food and other supplies. The Spanish started to feel that they were unlikely to capture Gibraltar merely through blockade. With additional forces, they began building a further 4-gun batteries upon the isthmus. However, these new batteries were within range of British guns. That summer, the British managed to hit a large Spanish gunpowder magazine. It exploded, causing a series of major fires and further blasts, as more magazines ignited, causing considerable loss of life, ammunition, and other stores for the Spanish. Undeterred, the Spanish rebuilt the batteries, and by late 1781 had even extended them. At this point, General Elliot gained information from Spanish deserters that a massive assault was being planned. He therefore decided to preempt the assault. At 2 o'clock on the morning of the 27th of November, 1781, the British launched their attack with 2,500 men formed into 3 columns. The column on the right soon encountered enemy sentries. Charging and storming the Spanish lines, they shot and bayoneted the defenders, forcing the Spanish to withdraw. The column on the left soon captured the forward westerly Spanish positions, while a Hanoverian regiment, mistaking their target in the dark, attacked and captured a huge mortar battery. The center column consolidated the captured positions in preparation for a Spanish counterattack. Meanwhile, the left column pushed forward again along the seashore, meeting light resistance before storming a further 2 batteries, capturing trenches and putting the Spanish to flight. The British now set about destroying the Spanish lines and batteries. Booty was taken wherever possible to supplement the garrison's provisions. But otherwise, weapons and defensive structures were destroyed and Spanish guns were spiked. Batteries and siege works were soon engulfed in fire as the British set light to Spanish ammunition. With the Spanish batteries and lines completely destroyed, the British withdrew back inside their own fortifications as huge explosions of ammunition ripped through the Spanish lines, destroying whatever was left. British and Hanoverian casualties were just 2 killed and 25 wounded, while the Spanish lost over 100 men killed and a further 30 taken prisoner. In one night, the British had totally destroyed 14 months of work by the Spanish, which had cost them over £2 million, equivalent to over £350 million as of the year 2020. Relieved of having to defend against any possible assault, the British began extending their defences by building extensive tunnels through the actual Rock of Gibraltar. Openings in the rock face, known as embrasures, were cut to provide new gun positions which overlooked the Spanish lines from a considerable height. And a new type of cannon mount was invented by George Kohler, which enabled cannons to fire at a downward angle so they could be fired down a slope. British guns situated in the embrasures could now take advantage of the height of the Rock of Gibraltar by firing either downwards on attackers, or, when elevated, striking out further into the besiegers' lines. Life within Gibraltar was now more comfortable. Local merchants found ways of running the naval blockade, and even ships from Britain reached Gibraltar unmolested, bringing reinforcements and taking away the sick, the prisoners, and any civilians that wished to leave. Portuguese vessels also arrived, loaded with lemons, wine, and vegetables, helping the garrison to ward off scurvy. They also provided valuable intelligence about the Spanish. But in the early spring of 1782, news arrived that the British garrison in Minorca had surrendered to the French, and soon afterwards that Yorktown had fallen to the Americans. Morale amongst the garrison plummeted. But unknown to the garrison, peace talks were taking place between the British and the Americans. But they were complicated by the situation in Gibraltar. The British were attempting to split the Americans away from their ally France by agreeing to the independence of the 13 American states in exchange for a trade agreement. Meanwhile, the French, tired of war and short of money, found themselves tied to an agreement with the Spanish, who in turn remained adamant that they would not join the negotiations until Gibraltar had been captured, or they had received a guarantee that Gibraltar would be handed over to them. With the status of Gibraltar now a major international issue, France and Spain realized that they needed to swiftly capture Gibraltar to have any bargaining power at the peace talks. John Jay, the American peace negotiator, realizing the importance of the situation, said,
"We are very much occupied with Gibraltar. We stand at the threshold of great events. Pray God that they will be auspicious. I believe that they could bring very much close the epoch of peace which we all wish for, a peace both good and solid."
The French transferred their victorious troops from Minorca. 10 infantry battalions arrived together with engineers and pioneers, and a French fleet joined the existing Spanish naval blockade. And hoping for a more imaginative and successful outcome, the French general Louis de Crillon took over as the senior commander of the besiegers. The previously destroyed Spanish lines were swiftly rebuilt again, and by the autumn they had advanced still closer to the British fortifications. Using a tactic that had been successfully tried against Spanish gunboats that had dared to come too close, General Elliot ordered a bombardment of the enemy's rebuilt lines with red-hot shot. Known as hot potatoes, this was gunshot heated to furnace temperatures before being fired. At 7 a.m. on the 8th of September 1782, the British opened fire with both heavy guns and field artillery. Within a short time, the rebuilt timber batteries on the western side of the Spanish siege lines were on fire, and many of the other batteries were so badly damaged that they had to be dismantled. The French and the Spanish suffered 280 fatalities in this bombardment alone. Such was the success of this bombardment, Elliot ordered a furnace to be installed beside each battery. Louis de Crillon had already realized that merely blockading Gibraltar was never going to work, and that an attack by land was unlikely to succeed. He had therefore started work on a plan to create a squadron of floating batteries that, with support from land-based heavy guns, would pound the British batteries into submission by their sheer weight of numbers and the quantity of shot fired. This would be followed by an infantry attack from across the isthmus, while simultaneously further troops would be put ashore by the Spanish fleet. Old hulks were already being converted to floating batteries. They were strengthened with 1 meter thick wooden armour, packed with layers of wet sand and with water pumped over them to avoid fire breaking out. Old cables, more timber and sand were used to ballast the boats, as their starboard batteries were completely removed, with all their guns transferred to the port side. On the 13th of September 1782, Louis de Crillon launched his great attack. 5,500 French and Spanish servicemen manned the 10 floating batteries, containing over 200 guns. They were supported by the Spanish and French fleets, plus Spanish gunboats and bomb vessels. There was further support from 86 land guns that had been recovered from the British bombardment the previous week, plus 42,000 Spanish and French infantry ready to assault the British defences once they had been breached. Such was the excitement that over 80,000 Spanish spectators thronged the adjacent hills, expecting to see the fortress of Gibraltar destroyed. The lumbering, unwieldy, floating batteries moved slowly forward along the bay, and one by one their guns opened fire. When the British guns replied, their cannonballs seemed to bounce off the floating batteries' hulls. But being so unmaneuverable, the floating batteries were difficult to get into position to inflict maximum damage upon Gibraltar's defences. Meanwhile, the heavy land-based Spanish and French guns were being more effective in causing damage to British fortifications. But before long, they ran out of gunpowder, By midday, the artificers had the furnaces up to temperature, and Elliot immediately ordered the red-hot shot to be used. The crews on the floating batteries, thinking that they had successfully doused the shot that had landed on their decks, did not realize that the shot was gently smoldering and slowly burning into the timber of the batteries. Their attention was more focused on the floating batteries dragging their anchors. Soon they started to run aground, bringing their rigging and masts crashing down. As crews struggled to recover their boats, smoke was spotted coming from two of the closest floating batteries, causing panic on board. Meanwhile, the small fleet of 12 British gunboats under Naval Commander Roger Curtis had sailed out of Gibraltar Harbour to attack the Spanish floating batteries. Unexpectedly, their mission soon turned into a rescue operation, with them taking hundreds of prisoners. By nightfall, the fires on the floating batteries were out of control. Suddenly, one of them exploded as the fire reached the gunpowder magazine, killing many on board. Shortly afterwards, a second floating battery exploded. Curtis, realizing it was now unsafe to be near the floating batteries, withdrew his gunboats. It was too late to rectify the situation. One after the other, the floating batteries exploded in horrific fashion. At daybreak, just two remained. A couple of small Spanish boats were sent to rescue men still on board, but coming under fire from the British, they were quickly sunk. By midday, all the floating batteries had been destroyed, leaving the Gibraltar waterfront a mass of wreckage, debris, and dead bodies. Over 720 men on board the floating batteries had been killed, and a further 350 taken prisoner. On top of that, a further 500 casualties had been sustained from the British bombardment of the siege lines. In comparison, the British had lost just 15 killed and 68 wounded, most of them from the Royal Artillery. Such a brutal defeat created consternation in both France and Spain, with each country throwing recriminations at the other. Political leaders ordered a land assault upon Gibraltar, but senior generals cancelled the operation, fearing more huge losses. Meanwhile in Paris, John Jay, the American peace negotiator, had just submitted his draft treaty when the news of the disastrous assault upon Gibraltar arrived. The British promptly stiffened their terms. They flatly refused to cede land to the Americans north of the River Ohio, and they insisted that the Americans pay their national pre-war debt to the British and compensate loyalists for their seized property. The Americans were forced to agree to all these terms, other than it was eventually agreed that the Great Lakes, rather than the River Ohio, would form the border between the United States and the British Empire. On that basis, Articles of Peace were signed between Britain and the United States at the end of November. By now, France, financially and physically exhausted by the war, felt they had done all they could to assist Spain achieve their war aim. They urged the Spanish to offer Britain some substantial territories in exchange for Gibraltar. But the British had already dispatched a substantial fleet and convoy under Admiral Richard Howe to break the siege. Learning of this, the French and the Spanish realized that their only chance of achieving anything from the peace talks was by preventing the fleet from reaching Gibraltar. However, Admiral Howe completely outwitted his rivals and sailed into Gibraltar. 31 transport ships and 35 ships of the line delivered food, vital supplies, ammunition, together with a further 3 infantry battalions. Spanish resolve crumbled. They joined France in seeking an exit from the war. But while negotiations dragged on the 1st of February 1783, the reinforced British garrison launched an attack upon the besiegers, inflicting further damage and casualties upon the already demoralized French and Spanish. That was enough. The following day, the French and the Spanish settled for the terms previously agreed between the Americans and the British. After 3 years, 7 months and 12 days, Britain was to remain in possession of Gibraltar. Part of the British success in holding Gibraltar was due to the locally raised Soldier Artificer Company. Prior to the Great Siege, the British Army had relied upon civilian labour to undertake its engineering work. But events in Gibraltar proved there were many benefits in bringing such work within the disciplines of the British Army. Just 4 years after the end of the siege, the Corps of Royal Military Artificers was established in Great Britain, along the lines of the Soldier Artificer Company in Gibraltar. Then, 10 years later, the two were merged to form the regiment that is today known as the Royal Engineers. As a final thought on the Great Siege of Gibraltar, Britain's commitment to the defence of Gibraltar and Minorca consumed troops and ships that were desperately needed by them in North America. More troops and more ships were used in the defence of Gibraltar than at Yorktown. With so many military resources unavailable for British service in North America, the Great Siege of Gibraltar may well have fundamentally affected the outcome of events that led to America's independence.